to military, sometimes referring to the power of the purse. And then you have soft power. And soft power is really referring to your cultural power. America's soft power abroad is very expansive, in particular nowadays. In particular, because of Hollywood, and because of how popular our culture is in other parts of the world. But American soft power is really going to be arising during the 50s with the growth of TV and the growth of Hollywood. At the same time as you have this consensus culture, you also have rejections of this consensus culture. You guys read about the Beats, in which you had groups of people in the cities who were writing out and speaking out against the consensus culture, talking about how maybe the American dream wasn't as grand as it seems. A lot of the racial inequality, for an example, that was underneath this consensus culture being buried, is something that the Beats generation kind of pointed to say, wait a minute, this consensus culture doesn't really represent the majority of American lives. The only American lives it really represents is middle class Caucasian families. In particular, the growth of rock and roll, which you guys read about, like Elvis Presley, the idea that the youth is going to actually come away from this consensus culture to form their own kind of counterculture at the time, which is only going to be strengthened in the 60s. But the origins of that counterculture come from the 50s, come from the youth at this time. On this slide, you also see, you guys notice, Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy. These are both TV shows during the 50s that's really going to show us this consensus culture. And for the time period, for people watching TV, which, like we talked about, was majority of Americans, it's really going to perpetuate this idea of a consensus culture. In both I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver, you have individuals who live in the suburbs. They're both middle-class Caucasian families, kind of that nuclear family model in which you have the male as this traditional role and the female as this traditional role. And these TV shows really try to expand, and they really become a source of influence subconsciously in the American mind to agree or buy in to this consensus culture. All right, guys, the early civil rights movement. One thing that you need to understand about the early civil rights movement, which your reading definitely went much more in depth in this, is the idea that if you want to get something done, achieve racial equality, don't wait on the executive branch. Don't wait on the legislative branch, because these branches of power in American government are not helping minorities in the United States to solve these social issues that we have. Instead, what people this time period are doing is they're looking at the Supreme Court. So just to refresh, in case you guys need a little bit for political science, you have the executive branch, which is like the presidential power, right? He executes laws. And then you have the legislative branch, which the legislative branch is all about creating laws. And then you have the Supreme Court, or also known as the judicial branch, our federal court system, basically, in which the Supreme Court is going to evaluate laws. And basically what was happening is you would actually have members pushing, like the NAACP, for example, pushing for racial equality that would actually challenge a law in front of the courts, which at this time was a way to actually push for change legally. We have Earl Warren, which Earl Warren first was a governor in California, eventually is appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Warren is very liberal at this time. In fact, his court becomes to be known as Warren's Court, in which if you are an organization pushing for social change within the United States, if you take it to Warren's Court, generally the court is going to, which that is a picture of him right here. Generally the court is going to make that decision in your favor. So the federal courts at this time is actually supporting the civil rights movement and helping to springboard this movement. Just to kind of remember or go back, we talked about how in World War II, you're going to have these war crimes. You're going to have these atrocities being committed around the world. And one of the things that people are looking at, and one of the things people are talking about, is segregation within the United States. And should segregation be legally allowed, or should this be legally upheld whenever you have these war crimes and mistreatment and persecution of religious groups abroad, of races abroad? But then you have segregation in the United States. But the United States is supposed to represent something better. It's supposed to represent the land of the free. And so if you are to put down a race or a religious group, then that's not really adhering to American freedom, especially if we're supposed to be different than those other countries, those totalitarian countries. So from World War II, we really have, which, the civil rights movement, origins of civil rights movement is going to come before World War II as well. But during World War II, we're really going to have intellectuals within the United States start really thinking about these things and supporting the civil rights movement even more. So after World War II, whenever we actually take it to the courts and we see actual change start to happen within the United States, it's going to really springboard this civil rights movement. Not start it, because the origin was earlier, but really exemplify and perpetuate what was already happening in American society at this time. All right, we are going to talk about these things much more next week, but just looking at the 50s. Oh, I don't know where to put this. Okay. But just actually looking at the 50s, we're going to have Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks really sparks the Montgomery bus boycott. And then from there on out, we're going to have Martin Luther King Jr., who was in Montgomery or came into Montgomery at this time to start leading the civil rights movement. It wasn't like Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus and the boycott arose. And then years later, the movement got organized. No, it was like bam, bam, bam. You have Rosa Parks go forth, her decision. You have this bus boycott. And in a matter of months, you have people getting together to organize to push for change. And Martin Luther King Jr. at this time is who they decide should be the face of that change. So he was a leader in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, this conference was made up of civil rights activists, people who wanted to push for change, for racial equality, as well as religious leaders, oftentimes for both. But the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is going to be that joint between liberals who want to push for social change in solving some of these social issues and taking that religious undertone to it, to really adhere to American culture. In 1956, we are going to see, because remember the Supreme Court generally is on the side of the civil rights movement at this time. So we're going to have the Supreme Court rule that segregation in public transportation is unconstitutional. So victory there for Rosa Parks. Okay. Earlier, we had talked about how you have the Supreme Court, and you guys saw Brown versus Board of Education. This is very popular history, so I don't want to talk about it a whole lot, especially being as, our school. But with Brown versus Board of Education, basically the Supreme Court's going to step in, and the Supreme Court's basically going to say segregation in the public schools is unconstitutional. You cannot have something be separate and equal at the same time. It just doesn't work out. It is now unconstitutional, and that schools now need to integrate both or all races within the United States. You cannot keep them separate any longer. Now, we are going to have in 1956 a response to this Supreme Court decision known as the Southern Manifesto, in which the Southern Manifesto really accumulated a lot of this massive resistance that you guys read about to desegregation, stating that